My name is Eleanor, but everyone calls me Nellie. I'm 60 years old, a widow, and I've lived in this house for 3 decades. I've taken care of everything: bills, maintenance, gardening, and my simple routine. A year ago, my son Marcus and his wife Briella moved in. They said it was temporary after the business deal went wrong. They gradually took over the master bedroom, my office, and the rules. I was left with the guest room and the kitchen. I gradually became smaller in my own home, accepted it because I'm a mother, and thought it was a phase. Briella started with funny remarks about my age. Then came the chore lists and criticisms of my cooking. I washed, ironed, and shopped, and was still told I wasn't helping. Marcus said it was stress, that I should take it easy. I saw his gaze shift away from mine when she attacked me. I took a deep breath and kept my limits in mind, but each day cut a little bit of my silence. On Friday, Briella prepared a dinner for 12 guests. I set the table, keeping the napkins lined and flowers in the center. The house felt like a party, but I was on high alert. She walked around the room as if she owned the place. I brought the main course and placed it on the sideboard. The guests raved, and for a second I felt seen. Briella picked up a plate, took a bite, and made a disgusted face. And what happened next I will never forget. She threw the plate on the floor, the sauce splashing onto my shoe. "Clean it on your knees," she said, laughing, looking at the others. No one moved. Some lowered their eyes. Marcus stood there, glass in hand, saying nothing. I felt the blood drain from my face and my heart pound in my ears. I crouched down but stopped before touching my hands to the floor. Then I understood that the humiliation had become routine, and that if I accepted it, it would become the rule. I stood up slowly, held the cloth, and breathed. I told her I'd take care of it after dinner, calmly and without a scene. Briella rolled her eyes and made a comment about stubborn old lady. Marcus tried a silly joke that died in the air. I picked up the pieces one by one, wondering what was to come. The sound of the glass in the bucket sounded like a clock. Each piece was a limit of mine returning to its place, and I decided that night would be my last like this. When the guests left, I went upstairs to the guest room. I closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at my hands. They were shaking, but not with fear, with determination. I opened the drawer and took out a thin leather folder. Inside were keys, documents, and contacts. I'd never been dependent. I'd simply chosen to observe. Tomorrow would be Saturday. I'd have the weekend to organize. Monday at 9 a.m., I'd be me again. You need to understand something no one here knew. The frail elderly woman was the cover I wore for months. I'm the CEO and majority owner of Harrison Holdings, with $47 million in assets, 12 commercial properties, 3 residential properties, and 1 office building. Among the tenants is Meridian Marketing, where Briella works. The building is mine and the lease is on my desk. I didn't tell anyone at home because I wanted to see character. Yesterday, the proof came flying in on a plate. I spent Saturday reviewing important paperwork and emails. I spoke with my property manager over the phone, keeping it simple. I asked him for an appointment at the administration office for Monday at 9 a.m. I sorted through the recordings from the house's internal cameras. I recorded dates, times, and repeated phrases. I had saved the call and message logs. I began putting together a simple, objective, chronological dossier. No soap operas, just facts. On Sunday, I went to the garden before the sun blew down. I cut the dead ends off the rose bushes and watered them gently. The house was still quiet after the social hangover. I thought a lot about Marcus, the boy I raised. He's not bad, but he chose to close his eyes. Love isn't a license to erase myself. If I let it, it would become an authorization to get worse. I needed to separate mother from boundary keeper. After lunch, Briella came back to ask about dinner. She mentioned embarrassing myself in front of the guests. She said I should apologize and accept new rules. I listened without interrupting, with the calm I'd learned to have. I thanked her for her concern and went upstairs to my room. It wasn't a day to fight. It was the day before I took action. I wrote on a piece of paper, dignity, home, boundaries, proof. That would be my compass. On Monday, I arrived at my office at 8:50 a.m. I greeted the team, sat at my desk, and opened my diary. At 9:15 a.m. sharp, the property manager arrived with the folder. I reviewed the Meridian contract and the building's policy. Serious workplace misconduct has a clear procedure. I contacted security to follow up on the notification. I asked them to prepare Harrison's letterhead with my signature. Nothing illegal, everything in writing. At 11:30 a.m., we arrived at the Meridian building. The receptionist was shocked when they saw me arriving at the front. I requested the presence of management and HR. I explained what had happened objectively, without adjectives. I showed them the section of the contract regarding conduct on the landlord's premises. I authorized the suspension of access and an immediate investigation. Security waited for the formalization and monitored the procedure. I didn't flinch. I simply returned to my seat. When Briella appeared in the hallway, clutching her purse and talking loudly on the phone, I was standing in the company conference room. She hadn't expected to see me there. She stopped, blinked twice, laughed nervously, and asked what I was doing in that building. I simply handed the folder to the manager and asked him to read the notification aloud. Her face turned red, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't have a ready answer. She tried to claim it was stalking, that I was using mother influence. But when she saw the letterhead with my full name, Eleanor R. Harrison, CEO, her mask slipped. There was no denying she'd crossed a line. Security followed her exit, and each step echoed as if it were the end of the charade she'd put on for months. I returned to the office and sat in silence. I didn't celebrate, I didn't laugh. I just felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. I spent the morning reviewing more documents and asking the legal team to prepare the eviction notice. It's my house, and no one has the right to treat me like a guest there. I gave them 30 days to leave. For the first time, the temporary had an expiration date. That night, Marcus called me into the living room. He tried to speak softly so as not to wake Briella. He said I was overreacting, that she wasn't abusive, just difficult. I looked at him and asked if he remembered the look on his daughter's face, my granddaughter, when her mother yelled at me in front of everyone. He lowered his head and didn't respond. His inaction hurt more than any broken plate. I spent the next few days gathering evidence. I reviewed cameras, saved audio, and organized the messages chronologically. I discovered call logs from them trying to schedule meetings to discuss my legal incompetence. I also found strange credit transactions in my name. It wasn't just domestic abuse, it was a campaign to seize my assets. This made it even clearer that there was no turning back. When I handed the file to my lawyer, he looked at me seriously and said, "You did well to document everything. There's enough evidence here to defeat any attempt against you." It was like being told I was safe in my own skin again. I no longer depended on emotional conviction, but on facts. It was indisputable. By the end of that week, I received calls from recruitment agencies. Some tried to check Briella's references, and I realized her. Professional isolation had already begun. I didn't need to lift a finger beyond what was already in the system. Reputation matters, and she dug her own grave with her behavior. What had once been social prestige now became an awkward silence around her. Inside the house, the atmosphere turned into a cold war. She avoided looking at me, speaking only to Marcos in a loud voice, trying to prove some kind of superiority. He, in turn, was torn between marital loyalty and the weight of what he knew held in my hands. I didn't shout. I didn't react. I just waited for the days to tick by on the calendar. Her every forced laugh sounded like a countdown. One night, I heard them arguing in the master bedroom. My name came up repeatedly in rapid, nervous sentences. I realized Marcos had seen the entire file. The fragile mother narrative had crumbled, and he didn't know how to put the pieces together. It was too late to deny who I was. He would have to choose whether to treat me with respect or follow her lead. But the consequences were already clear. The next morning, he knocked on my door. He entered slowly, his eyes weary. He said he never imagined I was still so active in business, that he felt deceived. I took a deep breath and replied, "I was deceived, Marcus. I believed you would protect me in my own home, and you chose silence." There was no argument. He just stood there like a lost child and left, exhausted. In the days leading up to the move, I began reorganizing my spaces. I removed my clothes from the guest room and moved them back to the master closet. I cleaned out drawers and replaced my family photos in the living room. Every detail was a piece of dignity restored. I didn't need to yell or forcibly evict anyone. Time and truth were doing the work. When the moving truck pulled up in front of the house, I stood on the porch. I watched their furniture being loaded one by one. Briella walked past with her head held high, but her eyes betrayed anger mixed with fear. Marcus avoided looking at me. I felt no hatred, just a steady calm. This house was mine again, and I was back in control of my story. The day after moving, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was silent in a way I'd forgotten. I went down to the kitchen, made myself some coffee, and sat at the table. The sun streamed in through the open curtain, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the space belonged to me again. There were no heavy footsteps, no loud orders, just the sound of the kettle and the smell of fresh coffee. I grabbed a bucket of warm water and dish soap and went straight to the dining room floor. The sauce stain was still there, like a scar from the scene I'll never forget. I knelt down, scrubbed slowly and cleaned until there was no trace left. I didn't cry, I didn't smile. I simply felt that this was my act, not an act of obedience. It was me telling myself, it's over. Late in the afternoon, Marcus appeared alone. His eyes were red and he looked like he hadn't slept. He asked to talk and sat down on the living room armchair. He said he wanted a second chance, that he was confused, that he loved me, and that he didn't know how he'd let things get this far. I listened in silence, without interrupting. When he finished, I said slowly, "I'm still your mother, Marcus. My love won't go away, but my respect must be earned. You chose to close your eyes when I needed it most. Forgiveness doesn't erase the facts. We can start over, but only if there's a clear boundary between us." He didn't like the firmness, but nodded. Perhaps he understood. In the following days, I began to reorganize my routine. I returned to work from the company's main office more frequently. I gathered my team, reviewed projects, and realized that while I hid at home, they were carrying the load. It was a shock to see how needed and respected I still was in the world I'd built. I wasn't a shadow, I was the foundation. I talked to my daughter, Sarah, who lives in another city. She was relieved to hear I'd taken action. She said she felt guilty about not being around, but I reassured her. I explained that what I needed wasn't protection, but rather to regain the courage to act. We agreed to see each other more, to strengthen the bond that had been forgotten amid the family's arguments. At home, I reopened the curtains that had been closed for months. Light flooded the rooms again, and even the air felt lighter. I bought new flowers for the garden and asked a gardener to help revitalize the space. The plants which had wilted, regained their color. Every detail was a reminder that I was allowing myself to live again. Some neighbors came to visit, curious about the sudden change. I didn't share details, just said I was reorganizing the house. They smiled and said they hadn't seen me so confident in a long time. It was strange to realize how much I'd lost sight of myself in recent years. Invisibility begins within, and I was turning that around. One afternoon, I sat on the porch and listened to the birds. I grabbed a notebook and wrote a sentence. Dignity is not negotiable. I put it on my office wall. Every time I go in there, I see it and remember it. This is my guiding light now. I accept nothing less, not from my son, not from my daughter-in-law, not from anyone. Life went on more calmly. I received invitations to company-related social events, and I accepted some. It was good to reappear in public not as the sluggish old lady, but as the professional I've always been. People were surprised to see me active, as if I'd returned from a retreat. In reality, I'd just returned to myself. One night, Sarah video called me. I showed her the tidy living room, the blooming garden, and even the kitchen full of life again. She smiled and said, "That's the mother I know." It was at that moment that I understood the impact of my decision extended beyond me. I was rebuilding not only my dignity, but also the bonds that truly mattered. I closed this cycle without resentment. I don't hold any hatred for Briella or Marcus. Holding on to hatred would be keeping the chains on. What I learned was a lesson. I learned that silent power is worth more than a performance-based scream. I learned that a mother's love doesn't mean enduring abuse, and I learned that when someone tries to erase you, you need to stand up, register it, and turn the tables. That's what I did. Returning to the company routine gave me back an energy I thought I'd lost. In the first few weeks, I immersed myself in meetings and important decisions. My team looked at me with respect and even a certain relief. Many thought I'd drifted away due to a lack of interest, but the truth was I'd let myself get trapped inside. Now, I was firmly back in my place. We reviewed contracts, opened new negotiations, and closed a major deal to expand one of the commercial buildings. I increasingly felt like I was proving not only to them, but to myself, that my capabilities had no expiration date. At 60, I was more clear-headed and prepared than ever. Meanwhile, Marcos was still trying to get closer. He sent messages, sometimes stopping by with simple excuses like, "I forgot an ID." I let him in, chatted, but didn't give in to the old pattern. I kept repeating, "Respect comes before any coexistence." He seemed uncomfortable, but gradually realized she was no longer the same submissive mother. One Saturday, Sarah came to visit me. We spent together the whole day walking in the garden and sorting through old albums. She told me she was proud of me. Hearing that from my daughter was like confirmation that I was on the right path. Love that is free from manipulation is empowering, and that's what I felt in that hug from her. Days at home became lighter. I started cooking again for pleasure, not obligation. I invited friends over for lunch, something I hadn't done in years. Amidst laughter and conversation, I realized how loneliness had numbed me. Healthy socializing brings life back. It was as if each meal was a reminder that my table belonged to me again. One day, I received an invitation to speak at an event for women entrepreneurs. I thought twice before accepting, but deep down I knew this was the time. I took the stage and shared my story. Not the intimate details of humiliation, but the essence. Never give up your dignity. I saw women in the audience wiping away tears, and I realized that my story could be a source of strength for others. On the way home, I stopped in front of the corporate building that's part of my portfolio. I looked up at the bright windows and felt proud. Not because they were bricks or offices, but because they represented independence. While many saw me as the invisible old lady, there was proof that I'd always been the structure behind it all. Marcos finally had a serious conversation with me a few weeks later. He admitted his mistake, that he allowed Briella to dictate how I was treated. He apologized again, this time more sincerely. I didn't give him easy answers. I told him I loved him. But that broken trust doesn't heal overnight. It was a process, and if he wanted to rebuild it, he'd have to show it with his actions. This conversation brought me peace, not because it solved everything, but because I realized my voice had returned to the relationship. I didn't need a theatrical victory, just respected boundaries. That was the real turning point. I learned to separate love from submission. The dossier I prepared was handed over to the appropriate authorities, not for revenge but for protection. If they tried to take any action against me again, I already had an official record. This precaution gave me peace of mind. I slept better knowing I was protected by the truth. Over time, I began to see the spaces in my house differently. I renovated the master bedroom, painted the walls, and bought new furniture. I made a point of transforming every corner into a symbol of a new beginning. The marks of the past were there, but not as an open wound. Now they were memories I never wanted to return to. On the porch, with the curtains open and the garden in bloom, I finally understood that I hadn't just reclaimed my home. I had reclaimed myself. It wasn't about kicking out abusers. It was about turning my switch back on. I was no longer the invisible elderly woman. I was the woman who decided to document, take action, and change the game. With the house renovated and my routine back under my control, I realized how solitude now had a new meaning. It wasn't emptiness, it was freedom. Being able to walk through the rooms without fear of being interrupted or diminished was a simple yet powerful pleasure. I took a deep breath and felt that air was mine. Sarah started visiting more often, even bringing her grandchildren one weekend. The laughter of the children running around the yard reminded me of when Marcus was little. I couldn't help but feel a tightness in my chest, but this time it wasn't sadness, but a mixture of longing and hope. The future could be different, as long as the same mistakes weren't repeated. I received a letter from Briella's lawyer alleging wrongful termination. I smiled when I read it, because I'd expected it. The case didn't go forward. The documentation I had was solid, the records were clear, and her reputation had already crumbled. It was like seeing a door slam shut. No further words needed. At the office, one of the directors commented that I looked refreshed. I laughed because deep down it was true. It wasn't a trip, nor a cosmetic makeover. It was about reclaiming my inner space. When someone treats you as useless, the worst trap is to believe it. I had almost fallen, but I recovered in time. One day, Marcus came back to visit me, this time without apologies or beating around the bush. He sat with me in the living room and told me that Briella had left, that he was thinking of starting his life over, from scratch. He cried, apologized again, but this time with fewer excuses and more truth. I listened and hugged him without promising anything beyond what I'd already said. Love, yes, but coexistence only with respect. That same night, I called Sarah and told her. She was surprised but happy to see that I was handling it with determination. She said something that stuck with me. "Mom, you taught us to walk on our own 2 feet. Now you're teaching us to walk with our own voice." That deeply touched me. I returned to actively participating in investor meetings. I was invited to join an advisory board, something that restored not only prestige but also purpose. At 60, I realized I didn't have to accept the invisible retiree role they tried to impose on me. I had more to offer, and I still wanted to see my projects flourish. One afternoon, I sat in the garden with a new notebook. I wrote down the milestones that marked my turning point: documenting, taking action, setting boundaries, and not backing down. They were 4 simple steps, but they changed my life. I thought about how many women my age still remain silent, believing they have no choice. I wanted them to know that there's always a way to turn things around. Weeks turned into months. The house once again became a space for healthy gatherings. I welcomed old friends, organized stress-free dinners, and for the first time in years, danced in the middle of the living room listening to loud music. I didn't need an audience, just the certainty that I was free in my own home. Marcus started visiting his children frequently, and our conversations became more mature. I learned not to expect from him what he might never be able to give. What matters is that now he knows he can no longer silence me, and that in itself is a victory. One morning, I opened the living room windows and saw the sun shining directly on the new carpet. I remembered the day the plate was thrown on the floor and smiled to myself. What had once been a scar had become a memory of overcoming. I had cleaned not only the floor, but also the emotional mess they'd tried to leave on me. I decided my story wouldn't be confined to the walls of my house. I sat in front of the camera and recorded my story for a real-life channel. I recounted every step with my voice and my face. In the end, I looked into the lens and said, "When they try to erase you, don't accept it. Document it. Stand up and turn the tables. What would you do in my place?" The public response to my story was greater than I expected. Hundreds of comments arrived within hours. People of all ages said they recognized themselves in my story, that they too had been silenced within their own homes or families. Some thanked me for showing them that it wasn't too late to start over. Reading that reassured me that sharing had been the right decision. It wasn't long before other invitations came my way. I was asked for interviews on local radio. Stations and even a television program contacted me. I accepted cautiously, choosing my appearance carefully. I wasn't seeking fame, but rather to create a space for more women to understand that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. With each speech, I felt stronger and more whole. At the company, my board realized that my public visibility ultimately reflected positively on the business. The image of a CEO who overcame humiliation and remained steadfast inspired even investors. Curious to see how the narrative they tried to use to diminish me became the very source of my strength. What was once a weakness became respect. At home, I stuck to my new rules. Marcus would come over, but he always warned me beforehand and respected my space. Little by little, I felt he was learning, perhaps for the first time, that a mother is neither a servant nor a repository of frustration. The relationship was still fragile, but it was rebuilding, and I accepted that time would tell how far we could go. One day, I received flowers with a card signed by him. The words were simple: "Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I failed you." I tucked the card into the notebook where I write down my reflections. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was genuine, and that, to me, was worth a lot. I also decided to renovate the house's facade. I replaced the doors, painted the walls, and had new light fixtures installed. Each external change reflected the transformation within. Neighbors commented that it felt like a new residence, and I smiled, because deep down it truly was. Not just a new house, but a new Nellie living inside it. I began walking around the neighborhood every morning. People would greet me and I would respond lightly. This simple contact reminded me that I wasn't isolated from the world, as Briella wanted me to believe. My presence was noticed, and that gave me strength. I discovered that invisibility isn't fate, it's choice, and I wasn't choosing anymore. On the advisory board I joined, I met other women who had also faced difficult experiences, some younger, some older, but all with one thing in common. They were underestimated. We created a support network that met monthly. It was good to share experiences and realize that, together, no one had to carry the weight alone. I also received messages from women who lived silently in their own homes. Some said they hadn't yet had the courage to speak out, but that my story had made them think differently. I always replied, "It's not easy, but it starts when you decide that enough is enough, one step at a time." I felt like I was planting seeds. For my 61st birthday, Sarah threw a small surprise party. Nothing grand, just family and close friends. When I walked into the room and saw everyone smiling, I felt a warm glow in my chest. It was a stark contrast to the dinner that had changed my life months before. This time I was celebrated and respected in my own home. Marcus was there, quiet but present. He brought a cake he'd bought himself and sang happy birthday along with everyone. It wasn't complete redemption, but it was a gesture. I knew rebuilding would take time, but at least I had the will to try. And that was enough for me at that moment. That night, before going to sleep, I thought about how life can turn upside down in such a short space of time. I had been humiliated, called useless, and treated like a burden. Today, I was a role model, in control of my space. Everything changed because I decided I couldn't accept it anymore. That was the greatest victory of my life. After my birthday, I began to look at my life with more peace of mind. I no longer felt that tension in my body every time someone knocked on the door or raised their voice. The silence of the house was now a friend, not a threat. I learned to enjoy my own rituals, like drinking coffee on the porch or watering the garden before sunrise. I started receiving calls from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were old school friends, others acquaintances from social projects in the city. They all commented that they'd seen my story somewhere and wanted to congratulate me. I realized that unintentionally I had given voice to a problem that many people hid. This made me feel part of something bigger. One Saturday morning, I decided to visit the corporate building that manages part of the company. I climbed to the top floor and gazed out the window, observing the city. I thought about everything I'd built, brick by brick, contract by contract. That's when it hit me. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. My trajectory already spoke for itself. Sarah encouraged me to write a book about my experience. At first, I thought it was an exaggeration, but then I thought better of it. It wouldn't be a glamorous biography, but rather a real manual for survival and regaining dignity. I began jotting down chapters unhurriedly, like someone talking to someone close to me. Writing was liberating. Over time, even my health improved. Routine checkups showed more stable blood pressure and less stress. The doctor said I felt like a different person. I smiled because it was true. A huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The body feels it when the mind finds peace. I also received an invitation to join an NGO that helps vulnerable elderly women. I accepted without hesitation. I saw myself in each of them, and I wanted them to know they weren't alone. At each meeting, I shared a little about my experience, and I saw the mix of pain and hope in their eyes. Marcus kept trying to get closer. He showed up more often at Sunday lunches, now always helping out, setting the table, trying to show goodwill. I hadn't forgotten the past, but I chose not to live trapped in it. The difference was that now I had clear boundaries, and he knew he couldn't cross them. On one of these visits, he took my granddaughter by the hand. The girl ran to me and hugged me tightly. It was a simple gesture, but it made me fall apart inside. I understood that amidst all the pain, there were still bonds worth preserving. True love survives when it is free from manipulation. One day, Briella tried to send me a message. I deleted it without responding, not because I harbor hatred, but because I've learned that I don't need to open doors to those who don't respect my walls. Some stories end without return, and that, too, is a victory. With the NGO, I began giving lectures at schools and community centers. I spoke about respect, dignity, and the importance of documenting abuse. Many young women listened attentively, as if I were a warning for the future. I realized that my voice resonated not only among older women, but also among younger ones. With each story I heard from other women, I remembered the broken plate on the floor. That scene, which once filled me with shame, was now my turning point. I don't wish this on anyone, but if it happens, want them to know there's always a way out. At night, when I close the living room curtains, I feel gratitude, not because life is perfect, but because it's now mine again. I've taken back control, and no one can take that away. It all started the moment I decided not to kneel. That memory will stay with me until the end. As the weeks went by, I began to notice how my home had become a gathering space again. Friends came over without fear of encountering a heavy atmosphere, and I made a point of opening the door with a smile. It was as if the walls breathed with me, freed from the weight they had carried. At the company, I started a mentoring project for young women who wanted to enter the real estate market. I shared mistakes, successes, and behind-the-scenes details of negotiations that never appeared in reports. The feedback was incredible. I saw the sparkle in their eyes and thought, if back then I had someone to encourage me like that, maybe I would have suffered less. One night, I sat alone on the porch with a glass of wine. I stared at the sky, remembering how I felt when Briella called me worthless. It was a stinging wound, but now it had healed. I smiled, thinking that somehow she'd given me the push I needed to get back on my feet. Sometimes, humiliation becomes fuel. Sarah called me almost every day, and our conversations were lighter. We talked about simple things, recipes, movies, childhood memories. This normalcy was precious. I no longer needed grand. It was enough to know that true affection was present and steadfast. One Sunday, Marcus asked me to have lunch, just the two of us. I accepted with some resistance, but I did. He cooked a rare occurrence, and during the meal, he told me he was in therapy. He said he wanted to better understand his own mistakes and be a different man. I didn't give him any ready-made answers, but I felt a glimmer of hope. Neighbors, who had previously whispered behind my back, now came to me for advice. One even said, "Nelly, you're an example of how not to let yourself be erased." I laughed, because I never imagined I'd become such a role model. I'd only done what I had to survive. Working with the NGO, I heard stories even worse than mine. Women who lost everything because no one believed them, or because they were afraid to fight back. Each case gave me more strength to carry on. I knew I couldn't solve everyone's problems, but I could show them that there is a way. I also started taking better care of myself physically. I started walking every day again, scheduled appointments I'd put off, and even started light dance classes. At first it felt strange, but soon I realized my body was responding well. It was as if I was relearning how to live from the inside out. In one of these classes, one of the women approached me and said she recognized me from a lecture. She said she was gathering the courage to leave an abusive marriage. We hugged tightly. I understood then that my story was no longer just mine. It was a seed that was spreading. At home, I put new photos on the walls, happy moments with Sarah, with my grandchildren, with friends. I completely erased the image of the house as a place of pain. Now it was a place of life. The marks of the past were there, but as a reminder of victory, not defeat. One afternoon, Marcus arrived with flowers and left them on the doorstep. He didn't come in, didn't ask for anything. He simply left a note. I'm learning to respect your distance. It was a small but powerful gesture. For the first time, he understood that love also means not invading. That night, I sat in bed and thought about everything I had experienced. From the broken plate to the note on the door, the story seemed unbelievable even to me. But it was real. I had been invisible, humiliated, erased. Today, I was seen, respected, and above all, my own person. In the following months, my life took on a new rhythm. It was no longer the tiring
Someone
routine
hiding
indoors, but it wasn't a hectic life either. I learned to balance between work, family, and social projects. I found a place where I felt useful without burning out. This was one of my greatest achievements. I started organizing small gatherings with women from the neighborhood. Each woman brought something to the table: cake, coffee, stories. There I realized how everyone, at some point, had felt invisible in their own homes. It didn't matter their age or financial status. It was almost universal. These conversations reminded me that I wasn't alone, never had been. At the office, an investor told me he admired my courage. He commented that in the market it was rare to see someone face family problems and still pursue their business steadfastly. That made me think about how many people confuse professional success with the absence of personal pain. The truth is, we all struggle, just not everyone shows it. At home, I developed the habit of keeping a journal, not filled with flourishes, but with facts and brief reflections from the day. When I reread it, I see how much I've evolved since that dinner episode. It's amazing how a few months can change the entire trajectory of a life. Sarah began bringing her grandchildren over often, and the house once again filled with the sound of laughter. There would be running through the hallways, drawings spread across the table, endless questions. It filled the rooms with life. It was the opposite of the heavy silence that had once reigned there. Marcus also showed up, but now with a different attitude. He helped with the grandchildren, helped in the kitchen, and most importantly, he didn't raise his voice. He seemed to understand that respect was a prerequisite for being present. He wasn't a perfect son, but he was a man still learning, and that was already a lot. One day, I received a call from a woman who had attended my talk. She said that after hearing my story, she decided to report the abuse. She suffered from her own brother. Her voice trembled, but it also carried strength. I hung up the phone with tears in my eyes. Knowing that my courage had inspired hers was one of the greatest rewards. At the company, I took advantage of this new phase to delegate more. I was still CEO, but I no longer had to shoulder everything alone. I gave young talent more room to grow, and I saw how they flourished when trusted. I learned that leadership isn't about controlling everything, but rather about enabling others to shine. One night, I sat in the living room and noticed the renovated walls, the new furniture, and the open curtains. Everything seemed to scream freedom. I thought about how that same room had been the scene of humiliation. Now it was the stage of my victory. With the NGO, we managed to approve a project offering free psychological support to elderly women who were victims of domestic violence. Seeing the first group gather deeply moved me. Many arrived with their heads down, but after a few weeks, they walked more upright, more confident. It was like watching several little Nellies reclaim their power. I received a local community leadership award. It wasn't for business, but for social work. When I walked on stage to accept it, I looked at the audience and said, "It's never too late to take back control of your life." I'm living proof of that. The applause that followed was more than recognition. It was confirmation. That night, I returned home and sat on the porch. I looked up at the stars and gave thanks, not to Briella, not to Marcus, but to myself. Because in the end, it all started when I decided to stop being treated as invisible. That was the key. That was the turning point. After the award, I felt my story had reached a point of maturity. There was no more anger, only clarity. I could talk about the past without trembling, without shrinking. It was as if the wound had healed completely, leaving only the mark that reminded me of what I must never accept again. Marcus continued trying to rebuild our relationship. One Sunday, he brought an album of old family photos. We sat together in the living room, leafing through them and laughing at memories. For the first time in a long time, we talked without tension. I didn't forget what happened, but I learned to see him as someone in transformation. Sarah told me I felt lighter. She kept saying, "Mom, you're shining again." I laughed, but I knew it was true. The oppression had extinguished my light for a time, but now it was lit again, and I no longer depended on anyone to keep it going. At the company, I delegated even more responsibilities. I began preparing Sarah to take over part of the business in the future. Not because I was tired, but because I learned that the greatest legacy is not to control, but to pass it on wisely. Seeing my daughter involved brought me pride and security. The NGO grew beyond our wildest dreams. We secured support from larger institutions. Our service expanded. I began traveling to other cities, sharing my experience. Each trip showed me the scale of the problem and, at the same time, the strength of women who refused to be erased. On one of these trips, a 74-year-old woman approached me, crying, and said, "You saved my life. I was about to give up, but I heard you speak and decided to fight back." That had a profound impact on me. It wasn't just my personal victory, it was the victory of many others. At home, the atmosphere was peaceful. The flowers in the garden grew strong, and I tended them as a living metaphor for what had happened to me. If before they had wilted from lack of care, now they bloomed because they received attention. The environment reflects the soul, and mine finally breathed freely. Marcus gradually became more present with Sarah and the grandchildren. I saw in his eyes a genuine attempt to make amends. I didn't know how far we'd go, but at least the respect was back. And that, for me, was enough. One afternoon, I received an invitation to give a lecture at a university. Young students wanted to hear my life experience. I took the stage and spoke without paper, from the heart. I said that the biggest mistake anyone can make is to believe that dignity has an expiration date. It doesn't. It never will. The applause I received that night resonated within me. I wasn't just the CEO, nor just the mother or the widow. I was a whole woman who had survived the attempt to erase me and had come back stronger. And sharing this was my way of giving back what I had received. On the way home, I sat on the porch again, with the same notebook where I jotted down my initial reflections. I added one more sentence. Don't wait for someone to turn on your light. Grab the switch. I closed the notebook with a sense of mission accomplished. As I lay in bed that night, I looked up at the ceiling and silently thanked it. Not fate, but the decision I made the day I refused to clean the floor on my knees. That's where it all began. And that's why I can say today, I'm not invisible. I never will be again. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to a tribute at the city council. I was recognized not only for my business work, but also for my advocacy for older women. When my name was called, I walked up to the podium with firm steps. I remembered the night at the dinner when I felt small. In that moment, I was big, and I didn't need to prove myself to anyone. In my speech, simply said, never accept being called useless. Age doesn't take away value. It only takes away the fear of speaking out. I've experienced this firsthand, and I'm here to tell you that you can turn things around. I saw emotional faces in the audience, and I felt my voice resonate. I returned home with a sense of mission accomplished. It wasn't about the award or recognition, but about the journey. I had emerged from the shadows and rediscovered my dignity. This was the greatest victory anyone can achieve. Sarah hugged me at the door, telling me she was proud. Marcos was there too, quiet but present. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Mom, thank you for teaching me, even through the pain." I just nodded because some answers don't need words. That night, I sat in the illuminated garden and reflected on how everything had changed. That space that had once been a scene of humiliation was now a stage of peace. The gentle breeze in the plants seemed to confirm I had won. Finally, I began writing I wanted to capture not only the pain, but also the rebuilding. I wrote so that other women, upon reading, would understand that they are not alone. My voice could be the breath of courage someone needed. Over time, I realized I no longer needed to look back with resentment. The past was written, but it no longer dictated my days. I owned the present, and that was all that mattered. Freedom came from knowing I owed nothing to anyone but respect for myself. At the end meetings, I began to hear stories of overcoming challenges inspired by mine. One woman said, "I thought of you and had the courage to say no." I smiled because I understood that my struggle had already become fuel for other victories. One Sunday afternoon, I made a point of opening my home to family and friends. This time, there were no rules imposed by anyone, just a warm welcome. I looked around and saw true love filling every corner. It was confirmation that the house, like me, reborn, had been. That night, before bed, I walked through the rooms in silence. I ran my hands over the walls, the photos, the furniture. Every detail reminded me that I had chosen not to be invisible. That choice changed everything. I took out my notebook and wrote the last sentence. Family doesn't protect against abuse, and limitless love becomes complicity. Underestimating is costly. Dignity is not negotiable. I closed it and left it on the table. That was my legacy in words. And now I leave a question for you who are listening to me. What would you do in my place?